People's Business is made possible by our partners, Solar Dynamics, the most efficient energy systems.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Business. I'm Wendy Burke. This Sunday evening, we will be looking at the topic of contemporary social development issues affecting the elderly. Yes, it's time that we're turning the microscope to our elderly, and to help us do it this evening, we have Mr. George Griffith, who is the coordinator of the Community Elder Care Program, along with Dr. Ambrose Ramsay, a geriatrician and consultant with the Geriatric Hospital. Welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, now if I can start with you first, Mr. Griffith, let's look, when we come back after the break, we're going to break the topic down and define some of these terms so that we can see the parameters that are impacting our elderly. We'll be back after the break. Now, this week we're going to be observing World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, Wednesday to be precise. And the local National Assistance Board, the entity which deals with our entity, would have held a service looking at some of the issues that are impacting. Let's hear now from Minister Kirk Humphrey before we head over to our panelists.
We've seen and heard of cases where people take older people's checks, spend their money. I know of cases where people encourage persons to spend their pensions on alcohol until it is all gone, or yell at them in the streets, or people perhaps not understanding how dementia works, or Alzheimer's works, or all these other diseases associated with getting old, treat people terribly. We know of cases where people move into the house, hoping to inherit the house, and treat the other person, the older person in the household, as if the house did not belong to them in the first place. These are things that we must speak out against. I began by telling you that the definition of abuse encourages those of us who treat people badly and those of us who know about it and say nothing, that we are all equally culpable.
Okay, gentlemen, we have a picture painted. Are these among some of the contemporary social issues that we're talking about in relation to our elderly? I'll start first with you, Mr. Griffith.
Well, I would, first of all, good evening to the listeners. Yes, I would say that these are some of the issues that are coming to the fore. I'm not saying that they did not exist before, but we are more aware of the abuse of the elderly in Barbados today. But I dare say that the lack of awareness which existed many years ago, people did not consider that abuse, but we know better now, and we feel that we have a duty to ensure that the public of Barbados understand that the senior citizens have rights and that their dignity must be preserved, and we must not believe that because they are old and perhaps infirm and vulnerable, that means that there's license for us to treat them as if they didn't exist. So yes, I would say that it is more in our face now than before, simply because modernization has made that possible.
Okay, what about on your end, Dr. Ramsay, in terms of the trying to preserve the dignity of our nation builders? What are some of the things that you tend to see within practice?
Good evening, everyone. I mean, as the minister would have spoken to, and Mr. Griffith would have also given his experience, I too see what I would say would be suspected cases of elder abuse. Because the reason why I say suspected cases is because before you can before you can call it really and truly, it needs to be investigated, and the evidence needs to be, let's say, put together, and then one action really be taken. And one of the issues that I think that we have here is that, you know, many persons still do not really understand what elder abuse is. Many persons may be actually committing abuse on their, in most cases, it's a caregiver, you know, who may be committing this abuse and are not really aware of what they're doing, and the potential consequences for what they're doing. And we also do not really have the a really good system where these cases can be reported and recorded and investigated. And hence, I am not aware of any significant amount of statistics as it relates to elder abuse in Barbados.
Okay, say for example, someone came into you to be treated, an 86-year-old gentleman. He's suffering from Alzheimer's, but you notice a lot of bruising, etc., about the body, and you realize that in him being brought for treatment, the person that tends to bring him tend to be a bit aggressive in their handling of him. Is this something that would raise the red flag for you?
Yes, that's definitely one of the red flags. I mean, the bruises, especially if they cannot be explained, especially if a plausible explanation cannot be given as to why the bruises are there, is a red flag. And again, the attitude of the caregiver that you would have described would also be another red flag. So this would be one of the cases that would need to be investigated. And you know, also in my interaction with the caregiver and the individual, the patient who you said is suffering from Alzheimer's, what happens is quite often is that people who provide care for persons with Alzheimer's really don't understand the illness, and hence they are not, let's say, equipped to address, you know, quite often the negative or difficult behaviors that this individual may be exhibiting.
Okay. Now, Mr. Griffith, we're talking about a community elder care program. Is that program likely to touch on these types of issues? One, helping the caregiver to better understand the illness and how to be able to control and temper themselves in terms of their treatment of the individual so that that abuse does not indeed take place.
Now, this is a very difficult issue, a challenging issue to address. For one, we need the legislation and the regulations that would empower the organization to address these matters as they come. And as Dr. Ramsay said, and I would like to elaborate a little bit on that, it is very difficult sometimes because the elderly person who is being abused sometimes does not always have the mental capacity to articulate what has happened to him or her. And therefore, it is very difficult because if the abuser is someone within the household, that person is likely to be very protective and will resist sometimes attempts to allow anyone else to be with that person alone. And Dr. Ramsay also spoke about dementia and Alzheimer's and so on. So sometimes the person who's being abused have a diminished mental capacity to the extent that they're not able to articulate what has happened. So even if you, given the existing regulations, even if you suspect, you strongly suspect that this is happening, and you have to get a statement from the person who has been the subject of abuse, it is very difficult to get that. And yes, we have to make sure that there is legislation. In fact, one of the advocates, international advocates, recently spoke, and I agree with them 100%, that we need a UN convention on the rights of older persons to protect their rights and dignity. Unless we have something like the UN stepping up to the crease, so to speak, and mandating that countries go in this direction, it is going to take us a very long time. So it is very difficult. You have a person who is abused, but the person is incapable by virtue of what is happening with them at the cognitive level to articulate this position. And that is a heaven so for the abuser, because they know that the person is not able to give a consistent story, although we know that persons with dementia or Alzheimer's have flashes of lucidity. There are days when they're sharp as a tack, but that can vanish as quickly as possible. So we really need the legislation, and we need to give the authorities the power and the authority in the same way that you can move into a house. If you suspect that a child is being abused, we must be able to do that with senior citizens. Otherwise, their lives will continue to be a living hell in this country.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that we would want, in the same way that you can treat to child abuse, to be able to treat to elderly abuse as it is. Now, what is the situation now in the event that it is proven, say maybe in a court of law? Where then does that individual go to reside? Or where would you suggest, if legislation comes, that we can place those individuals to get them out of harm's way?
That is why I said at the beginning that it is very challenging. We work closely with the police, and I'm aware that the Ministry of Social Care and People Empowerment is working as we speak on getting that done. In fact, the minister was well on the money this morning. He touched on all the major issues confronting the elderly, and I have every confidence that he and his technocrats and the professionals working in that ministry will push this issue forward. But at the moment, in fact, in discussion with the police, they said to us that they can only charge people with under the Offences Against the Persons Act. Now, I'm no attorney at law. I might be a village attorney, but I'm not a real attorney. And therefore, the police tell us that their hands are tied for the simple reasons that I outlined earlier. And we have still to balance very carefully how we intervene, because sometimes the older person, the person who is being abused, is in the care and protection of a next of kin. And that person might very well want you to come in and to work with them. But the next of kin said, no, you ain't coming in here. So that put us back at square one, and that is why I'm saying that we really need the legislation and the power and the authority to rescue some of these senior citizens. But I am not aware of any facility that you can go other than the regular district hospitals and the nursing homes and so on. But as it is now, and the minister is right, there's a lot of work to be done, and we are confident that if the people of Barbados join us in this effort, in other words, you have a suspicion, that you see something, you hear something, you report it, so that at least we can get a shoe in, so to speak. But we have a long way to go, and I'm confident that we are going to get there. In fact, this very
Okay.
program tonight is a good indication.
Okay, now we have to take a commercial break here, but when we come back, we will be taking your calls, 228-5562, 228-5563, and I have some more questions for Dr. Ramsay in terms of their care and the abuse issues. We'll be back after the break. And we're back. We're looking at the contemporary social development issues affecting the elderly. I want to go to a call now on the line. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Wendy. Did you on your panel?
Go right ahead with your question.
My question is, this is about mental abuse now, not really physical abuse. All of us are not going to reach the age of 100 years. I believe that when we reach the age of 67 and we're resigning, we should get a visit from the president now. And as the panel say, all of us have some Alzheimer's and all. When you reach that age, sometimes you don't even know who visit you. So I feel like something they should look at. From the time you get to the age of resignation, you should be getting a visit from the president.
Okay, that's your comment this evening?
Yeah, that's one of my things. That's something that they should really look at. All of that, and especially in this stage, now we're dying so fast.
Okay, thank you so much. He's speaking, gentlemen, to the issue of recognizing being elderly a lot earlier. And, you know, when you come off of retirement, 65, 67, you're already on your way down, type of thing. But what I want to know from you, Dr. Ramsay, is in terms of that abuse, how do you deal and cope with instances where the caregiver refuses to allow the individual to receive medical care for his or her condition?
That's a very good question. Now, you know, George would have alluded to this earlier, and because there's no legislation to say that this patient should be, or this individual who is suspected to be being abused, we have a visit, let's say, even from a social worker or a medical practitioner. There's nothing stating or mandating that. So the caregiver can actually refuse entry. They can refuse to take that person for medical care, and they can also refuse entry if let's say if the Ministry of Health shows up to do an examination, they can refuse. The only way that entry can begin is if there's an assistance from the Barbados Police Force, and that would have to be coordinated through the National Assistance Board, which is the entity that is charged with investigating these complaints in the community. Now, in the long-term care facilities, in private nursing homes, district hospitals, etc., suspected cases of abuse or reported cases of abuse are addressed by the Ministry of Health through the Chief Medical Officer.
Okay.
So we, we really need legislation to guide, to really help to improve the lot of the elderly. Just briefly on the gentleman who called in about mental abuse, he did mention mental abuse. Psychological abuse is also quite common. It's one of the most difficult things to address, to prove. But, quite often, if the caregiver is, let's say, amenable amenable, let's say the caregiver really doesn't understand what they're doing, and with the appropriate education to explain to that person that what you're doing is wrong, it's causing this person to be afraid of you, to be subject to be let's say forced into subjection to you, and it's not good for that individual. It's quite possible that some individuals will actually have a completely different approach, but of course there are others who know very well what they're doing. They have a purpose, and we really need the legislation to be able to address this as it relates to how do you address a situation like that. If you have to remove the older person from the setting in which they are, that in itself can have a negative impact on the older person, especially, even though the relationship may be an abusive one, to the older person, they may see it as all they have, and they may be willing to, put up with and tolerate the abuse, just to have, that person there to provide some of their needs.
What about the excuses that they're likely to make? Do we have a situation where a lot of these elderly folk blame themselves and they say, well, I refused to eat the food when he or she tried to feed me, so I can understand, should another family member come? Because sometimes a lot of these things come down to family disputes in terms of how the treatment is meted out. One person might have a more humane and genteel approach, whereas the other person believes, well, this old person is just too stubborn and they need to do what I say, when I say, how I say.
Can I say that sometimes it comes down to awareness, first of all, and then empowerment. Awareness, because sometimes the older person is not aware that he or she has a right to be treated in a particular way. And awareness, on the other hand, the caregiver or the family member might not be aware that what they're doing is a violation of the first person's fundamental rights and freedom. And I think that tells me that we need a consistent and persistent, assertive level of education and advocacy in the community. And that is why the Family Life Commission of the Anglican Church, in collaboration with the National Assistance Board, will be doing a series of these sessions across the country. My experience has been, and very often people, they call me to say that this parent is wicked and is stubborn. They're not doing this and they're not doing that. And I have to spend time to say, look, your mother is whatever the age, or father is whatever his age is, but generally 80 or 90 years old. And it is not that this person is wicked or stubborn. It is that this person's brain is not working the way it worked before. And that we have to understand that we have to then find the patience and the understanding to work with that person. So I think that family members really need this information and this education. And earlier we talked about the whole question of the granny dumping and so on. Like Dr. Ramsay, I don't like the term either. because some family members are really at their wits' end. Because when we're talking about the contemporary social development issues, look, modernization, housing, both persons in the household must go to work, and you have your mother or your father, and you're afraid to leave them in the house simply because they might light the stove and don't remember to turn it off, or they might turn on the gas on the one burner and try to light another. They might open a tap, they might have a fall, they might let somebody into the house, they might open the door and they might walk away. There's so many things, and some younger persons are at their wits and they just don't know what to do. And I believe we have to continue the information, the education, and the advocacy. And sometimes rather than condemn them, we have to try to understand their situation and help them. My
Okay.
experience has always been that once you are able to have a discussion, a dispassionate discussion with these persons, they come around to understanding, even though it is very challenging and they might not know, what to do next. But you really
Okay.
cannot condemn them out of hand. We have to understand their situation.
Okay, we'll take a phone call quickly and we'll take the call and we'll answer it after the break. Hello.
Hello, good evening to the host and good evening to your guests.
Good evening to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a few points, please. I don't specifically want to ask a question. I just want to make the point that I think that the topic of the issue of elder abuse, child abuse, peer abuse, noise pollution, etc., are all symptomatic of our shortcomings as a caring and compassionate society. I heard elderly persons on a call-in show elsewhere today making an impassioned and desperate plea to the authorities to bring some relief from the nuisance of kites being flown over their homes all day when they can't leave home to go anywhere. But I actually have two specific areas of concerns in relation to elder abuse. I the laundry in the kitchen sink, things like that. And another area that we need to pay attention to, we have, well, sort of racket and and step in and save our elder people from elderly citizens from that sort.
Okay, now we'll respond to his issues after the break. We'll be back in a bit. And we're back. I'm here with Dr. Ambrose Ramsay, a geriatrician and consultant at the Geriatric Hospital, and George Griffith, the coordinator of the Community Elder Care Program. Now, before we went off, we had someone on the line, but given that no representative here from the NAB, it's not exactly fair for us to try to discuss what they do or do not do at this point. But one thing that he did speak to, and a lot of people do tend to speak to it, is the issue of defrauding the elderly, whether it be out of their pension check, whether it be out of something significant like house and land, etc. I want to start with you, Mr. Griffith, in terms of the prevalence of this particular type of situation.
And very often, like the last caller, I would say that people make these allegations, and I would suggest to him that if he is aware that this is happening, then he needs to call the National Assistance Board and lodge a complaint. You know, it is safe to say that, without calling names, of course, that persons are in breach of the rules of procedure and so on. But members of the public are most reluctant to come forward and make a report. They will call in on the program, they'll make a report. But then if you say, well, look, the National Assistance Board number is 535-3131, call first thing tomorrow and lodge a complaint against the behavior that you are talking about so that it's investigated. So it is not generally fair to any worker for these allegations to be made and then no report is submitted, because then you're swiping blind, you're not in a position to do anything about it. But with respect to people's property, we talk about it and we hear about it on social media and so on. But like I said, if you know something is happening that is not right, come forward. You can even write a letter anonymously. At least the authorities would have an opportunity to investigate. So I would suggest to the gentleman or anybody else with intention, just call or take it to write it down, and I'm sure that it will be given the attention that it deserves.
Okay. Dr. Ramsay, do you come across patients who lament the fact that individuals have tricked them out of certain possessions?
Not often from the patients themselves, but quite often from the relatives or let's say children, or let's say let's say a friend who would report suspicion of certain activities going on. And the people who are most vulnerable to this kind of activity are those who are of cognitive impairment or let's say dementia, early dementia, etc. So it is happening, to an extent I'm not aware, because of course I'm just one experience. I am not sure about what else, the experience of other medical practitioners, what kinds of reports are made to the National Assistance Board. But I do know that there's also the option of reporting this to the police. Now, if if you have good evidence, a case can be brought to the police for investigation. Banks have records of withdrawals. They can often, well, if it's cash, of course, you can't trace where it's gone. But if they're checks and it can be traced, and I mean, there was a pretty topical case in the press, in the court cases, in recent times, where an elderly lady was defrauded of a sum of money, which some of it did get back after the appropriate, I guess, reports and investigations were made. Okay. I'm not sure if the National Assistance Board was involved there, but the police was involved. So there is recourse, but of course the police will want to have, I guess, some good evidence to act on.
Yes, that's true. We have a caller. Go right ahead.
Hello. Good night. Good night to everyone. Hello.
Go ahead with
Hello.
your question, ma'am.
Hello.
Ma'am, we can go ahead with your question. Listen to your telephone and not your television. Okay, she's gone off the line. Now, we're talking about defrauding. But there are times also when people will pray memories and the fantasies life that our elderly used to live. And a lot of promises tend to be given, Mr. Griffith, or a person might look like their son or daughter and they convince, yes, it is me, or I'm a close friend. You know, how can we help individuals? Because we know that it's the caregivers, but sometimes you may trust leaving your granddad at home because, you know, cognitively they're still well. People still prey on them.
Now, the community elder care came at the right time, I think, for Barbados. It was long, but it came at the right time because when COVID came and the country was faced with the restrictions and lockdowns and so on, it was recognized, it was made right that so many older persons were living alone, they were isolated, and they were lonely. And even when there were other family members, those members went out to work, left that older person at home alone, sometimes sitting down in a window from morning until night with no one to give them even a glass of or a cup of tea. Now, when people are isolated and lonely, they can become easily depressed and lacking in motivation and so on, starved for social engagement. So I'm saying the first thing we have to do is to make sure that family members spare a thought for those persons who are left alone all day. Some of these persons have been members of churches and they religiously give their collections every week or every month, as the case may be. And I believe that every church in Barbados and every group should have people who would feel that they have a mission to seek and search for those persons who are isolated and lonely and dropping on them to make sure that they're doing all right. So because when you don't do it, the person is so starved for social engagement, interaction that someone comes along, a smoker might come along. Next thing you know, the person do right things and the person have confidence, and because they're so lonely and they're so neglected, they might have tendency to gravitate towards that person. I think those are some of the ways that we can deal with it and prevent it from happening if we can, but there are too many persons in this. Prior to our program, of course, languishing in houses all day, and remember, in fact, they can be lonely in a house full of, because you're old, and therefore.
We'll talk about elderly daycare options when after the break, and also take some more calls. We'll be back to And welcome back to the program. We have a caller on the line. Good evening to you. State your question or your... Okay, we seem to have dropped that caller. I'll go now to Dr. Ramsay to talk about the issue of care for the elderly. And sometimes we tend to think that the geriatric hospital is the last resort, you know, when it seems as though their health is at a point of no return type of situation. But should we only be waiting until we can do no more at home to look to bring our elderly for care within institutions?
Well, let me first define daycare. Daycare is technically a social setting. This is where older persons come together under supervision, and they go through a program of activities throughout the day, at the end of which they do return to their own homes and families. It is a very good option in actually helping to keep older persons out of the long-term care facility. In other words, it often helps older persons to maintain cognitive function, good psychological health, physical function, and also it helps them to still feel alive, to put it simply, to feel alive. It gives some individuals something to look forward to. It provides for that social interaction that is necessary, one of the necessaries for good health. In some settings, in some special settings, special programs or activities could also be provided within the daycare setting. These would not be the everyday, the usual daycare programs. For example, at the St. Michael, the Geriatric Hospital, the St. Michael District Hospital, had a daycare program which offered at one point in time physiotherapy for persons who were, let's say, recovering from a stroke, or who might have been just hospitalized for a period of time. They're now frail, at home alone, and in need of social as well as physical activities. So daycare is a very useful program in helping to keep older persons out of the long-term care setting. It can delay by a significant amount of time the need for that person to come into the nursing home or into the long-term care facility, which quite often provides the end-of-life care. These are persons who often can no longer do their basic activities of daily living, which would include things like basic self-hygiene, dressing, grooming, preparing and eating meals. So persons who have difficulty providing those activities for themselves would become candidates then for nursing homes and long-term care facilities.
Okay, we have a caller on the line.
Yes,
Go ahead with your question or comment.
Yes, I would like to make a comment about the elderly abuse. What happened is those patients, the people that are caregivers, need to be trained, because some of those people, the memories is affected long-term, short-term as well. Sometimes they remember things. Sometimes they remember things way back, or they forget things, and the people just want to get them into hospital, and they just leave them in the outpatients and the casualties and don't go back for them. And it's a shame, because they need, these elderly people, they've worked hard and they need care. You imagine at the hospital they've got elderly for care. What is that? Because people are leaving them there and they have to admit them.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. She's speaking about something which, as we chatted earlier, Dr. Ramsay, you said you're not at all fond or comfortable with that's happening in our society.
Yes, and if I can, add to that, it's quite complex. It's a complex matter. George would have addressed um, this as well. We really need to understand what's happening. We live in a society in Barbados where, you know, it's been reported that our population is in decline. Actually, we're not having the population is not being replaced by births. And to add to that, many of our young, educated persons are leaving Barbados. They're going to other countries where they expect to make a better living. And what does that leave behind? It leaves the middle-aged and the older persons. So who's going to care for them? It's going to be that the state is going to have to step up. And one, the state is going to have to help to support those carers that remain out there in the community and providing care for those persons in the community that can still have that care provided there. And for those who are not able to remain in the community, you're going to have to put systems in place to take care of them.
Okay.
It's a problem that it's been with us for many years. It's
But
been
it seems to be worsening now.
it's worsening. It's worsening. Our elderly population is growing. As I mentioned earlier, we're not getting the births, and we're in a crisis situation.
Okay, we have a caller on the line. Good hello to you.
Good evening to you, panel. Hello, can
Go
you
right
hear me?
ahead.
Can you
Yes,
hear me?
we can hear you. Go right ahead.
Yeah. I want to say how much I appreciate the panel here, particularly Mr. Griffith. Now, his contribution clearly demonstrates that our country needs persons of his health. And I'll tell you, his care is so much needed that he is now even looking after the daily departed one. This shows how much the care is necessary. That's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is that I want to suggest that the government equips some of these drones with razor-sharp razors or something so that when these kites are up in the air flying, these drones can be directed and go on to cut these cords. But what they'll need to do is to cut the cord very close to the kite so that a long trail of cord would not be left hanging behind, so that the cord can hook up onto electric wire or into a tree and continue to fly and keep that noise. I want to suggest that the government look at that seriously.
Okay, the caller's gone. We have to take a break, and when we come back, we'll deal with those comments and more. We'll be back. People's Business is back. We're discussing the elderly and how we can do more in terms of their care and some of the things which are going on within our society that impacts on the level of care. Let's go to the phone lines now. Good evening.
Hi, good night to all.
Yes?
I have two questions.
Go ahead.
Okay, how can you tell when an elderly person cannot live alone? And number two, is it healthy for the elderly up in age to live alone? That's
Okay.
it.
Okay, I think perhaps Dr. Ramsay, I'll send these to you, and perhaps we should deal with the last person, the first after, and then you can cut in as well, Mr. Griffith. Is it right to have our elderly living alone? That was our second question. And the other one was, what are the signs that they would show or manifest to determine that they're unable to cope on their own?
All right, I would say in the... Oh, sorry.
Okay, I'll let the doctor go ahead first, Mr. Griffith, and then you.
Yes, simple. Yes, an older person can live alone. And as long as they have the physical and the cognitive ability to do so. And to your next question, what determines when a person cannot live alone? Well, one simple, if the person has significant cognitive impairment or dementia, they will not be able to live alone because they will not be able to function, they will not be able to maintain the home environment, they will not be able to maintain nutrition, they are unlikely to be able to maintain the environment. Quite often, the bills are not paid and hence the utilities are cut off. So once the person loses the mental ability to manage themselves, that is another good reason why the person can no longer live alone. Now, the person, another reason why an older person should not be living alone is that they may have the cognitive ability, but no, they do not have the physical ability to take care of themselves. They may not be able to walk.
Okay.
For example, an older person who was previously functioning independently and they have a stroke and they spend some time in hospital and now they can no longer walk. I mean, they can't even sit up. That person most likely is going to stay in the hospital until someone is identified to take them in or to look after them in their home, or to take them into their home to look after them, or be discharged to a nursing home.
Okay, you can, Mr. Griffith, your comment?
Yeah, and I would say that Dr. Ramsay has just described those persons who receive assistance from the National Assistance Board through the Home Care Program and the Community Elder Care Program. And really and truly, I believe that work is undervalued. People do not take into consideration that you have hundreds of persons each day whose needs are addressed by largely women. You only have a handful of men who walk through the sun and the rain every day in difficult circumstances in order to provide that care. And that adds a new lease on life to those persons. And I think that the government is spending a pretty penny on the program, but it is money very well spent, because these are persons really who are Barbadians. They're entitled to receive the quality of care, the best possible quality of care available. And I think it's a good policy to ensure that they're addressed. Now, not only older persons are addressed, because they're persons who may have had an amputation or stroke at a young age or a vehicular accident, and they're paralyzed, can do nothing for themselves. And this is where the National Assistance Board, through its hard-working members of staff, go out and minister to the needs of those persons.
Okay.
So I
If I
want
can
to take
just
them.
right
Good.
intervene here quickly, Mr. Griffith, to ask about this program. And Dr. Ramsay mentioned that our elderly population is increasing rapidly. Does the department have the capacity to manage the wait lists or the individuals in need of these services?
Well, according to the international figures, the elderly population is going to be doubled by 2050. So that is saying something, because in Barbados it is no different. People are living longer because of the good quality health care that we have, and we celebrate that. Every time we have a centenarian, we celebrate that. But bear in mind that with longevity comes certain challenges. And Dr. Ramsay mentioned the mobility issues and the cognitive issues, and therefore, we didn't mention this, but aging in place. You want to keep that person living in their own homes, their own familiar environment for as long as possible, so that keeps them out of the nursing homes or the district hospitals. It saves government tons of money when the year comes as well. And I think that is what we have to concentrate on. Yes, we will have more and more persons seeking assistance, and I think the program would have to be expanded in due course. But bear in mind that government has had a big hit recently with respect to its revenue, and we cannot expect the government to do all that is to be done. We want family members to feel an obligation to reach out and take care of these persons who have made tremendous sacrifice over time, to send them to school, to keep a roof over their heads, to put clothes on their backs and food in their bellies. And yet when they reach a stage where they cannot look after themselves, people are quite prepared to lock them in a house and go off wherever they have to go off. So I think that we really have to educate the public, and we have to come around to accepting that it is not right that we can just abandon people simply because they're no longer able to pull the load that they were pulling before. And I think we have to be as stark as that, and to say to a younger person, you have a duty, a moral duty, to look after your senior citizens, because in fact, I will want to...
Yes, Mr. Griffith. Okay. We're running out of time, so I really need to get Dr. Ramsay's parting comments in relation to, how do we deal with these issues impacting and affecting? What's the one takeaway you'd give us?
Well, as it relates to elder abuse, recognition is important. The ability to understand what is elder abuse, and also if you could identify, if people could be aware of the risk factors of elder abuse, and I'll mention them briefly. There are two big risk factors for the victim, and those would include functional dependence on the caregiver, okay? And then another one would be presence of dementia, cognitive impairment. And then you have and there are a number of others. Those are two big ones. And then you have some caregiver issues where you have people who may be abusing alcohol, caregivers who are using alcohol, who have mental illness, who are acting as caregivers, caregiver stress. Okay. So these factors are significant factors that work together in propagating elder abuse. Okay, so if we can identify those and
deal with them
and address them, we can make some strides.
Okay, and we know that Mr. Griffith on his end is doing all that is possible to help our elderly and provide that necessary care. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we have run out of time. This topic is a lot to unpack, but we're telling the public, care more for those who've cared for you. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming this evening. Mr. George Griffith, who's the coordinator of the Community Elder Care Program, and Dr. Ambrose Ramsay, a geriatrician and consultant at the Geriatric Hospital. Thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of our panel. Thanks for bringing your comments. And here's hoping that all of Barbados hears you and we stop elderly abuse. It's been a pleasure bringing the show to you this evening. I'm Wendy Burke. Do have a wonderful Sunday.